There is a moment, almost every night, when a plate of leftovers goes back into the fridge without a second thought. Tomorrow it will be warmed up again, eaten quickly, forgotten by lunchtime. But what if the simple act of reheating food is not as neutral as it feels? What if something invisible is happening inside that dish the second time heat touches it? Something your senses cannot detect, but your cells eventually respond to. This is not about panic. It is about understanding what actually happens at a chemical level when familiar meals get a second round in the microwave, and why a small number of everyday foods behave very differently from the rest once they are reheated. Most people think of food safety in terms of spoilage. Does it smell wrong? Does it look off? But some of the most researched concerns in food science have nothing to do with smell or appearance at all. They are about molecules forming quietly, invisibly, as a food goes from freshly cooked, to cooled, to stored, to reheated again. And a handful of very ordinary kitchen staples happen to sit at the center of this conversation more than almost anything else people eat on a weekly basis. Before naming them, it helps to understand the actual science behind why reheating is different from cooking. The first time you cook something, a series of natural chemical reactions take place. Proteins react with sugars under heat. Fats begin to break down and interact with oxygen. In vegetables, natural compounds called nitrates undergo their own transformations. In most cases, a single round of cooking produces these reactions in amounts the body is generally equipped to handle. The concern researchers have focused on is what happens with a second exposure to heat, especially after a period of cooling, storage, and time. During storage, even in a refrigerator, certain bacterial and enzymatic activity can continue at a slow pace. This means the food sitting in your fridge is not chemically frozen in time. It is quietly changing hour by hour. When heat is reapplied, those changes can accelerate, and in a small number of foods, this creates compounds that food scientists and cancer researchers have studied closely, including a class known as nitrosamines, along with heterocyclic amines and certain oxidized fat byproducts. Some of these have been classified by international health bodies as probable or possible carcinogens based on laboratory and epidemiological research, which means the evidence points toward increased risk with repeated high exposure over long periods of time, not that eating a reheated meal occasionally will cause disease. Context matters enormously here, and it is worth holding on to that nuance as we go through what the research actually shows. The first food worth understanding is processed meat, especially when it is reheated at high temperatures. Think of bacon, sausages, hot dogs, deli slices, and cured or smoked meats. These products already contain nitrites, which are added during processing to preserve color and prevent bacterial growth. Under certain conditions, particularly high heat, those nitrites can react with natural compounds in the meat to form nitrosamines. Research into dietary nitroso compounds has repeatedly linked high, sustained intake to increased risk for several cancers, with the pancreas identified in multiple studies as one of the more sensitive organs. This does not mean a strip of bacon is dangerous. It means that searing already processed meat a second time, especially until it is charred or blackened, is where the chemistry becomes less favorable. The practical insight here is less about elimination and more about method. Reheating processed meat gently, briefly, and at lower temperatures dramatically changes the outcome compared to microwaving it on high until the edges scorch. The second food surprises almost everyone because it belongs to the vegetable family people trust the most. Spinach, along with other nitrate-rich greens like kale, celery, and beets, is genuinely nutritious. It is rich in iron, folate, and antioxidants, and the nitrates it naturally contains have even been associated with cardiovascular benefits in fresh form. The complication begins after cooking, once the vegetable cools and sits. Bacterial activity, even under refrigeration, can gradually convert some of those natural nitrates into nitrites. When the food is reheated, particularly if it has been stored for an extended period, those nitrites can interact with amino acids under heat and form small amounts of nitrosamines. A study published in the journal Foods specifically cautioned against leaving cooked spinach at room temperature for more than roughly 12 hours, precisely because of this nitrate to nitrite shift. The irony is almost poetic. The vegetable chosen because it feels like the healthiest thing the plate can, under the wrong storage conditions, chemically shift in a direction opposite to what it was eaten for. The simplest adjustment is not to avoid spinach, but to store it properly, refrigerate it quickly after cooking, and when possible, eat leftover greens cold in a salad rather than reheating them on the stove or in a microwave the next day. The third food hides in plain sight in almost every kitchen. Cooking oil, especially when it has already been used once and is heated again. When oils rich in polyunsaturated fats, such as sunflower, corn, or soybean oil, are heated, a process called lipid peroxidation begins. Oxygen reacts with the fat's chemical structure, and a cascade of byproducts forms, including aldehydes and other oxidized compounds. Some of these have been shown in laboratory studies to interact with DNA in ways that concern researchers. Every additional heating cycle pushes this process further, and the oil's smoke point, the temperature at which it visibly starts to break down, actually drops with each reuse. This means the very oil that seemed stable during the first fry becomes chemically less stable by the second or third use, breaking down at lower temperatures and producing a higher concentration of these compounds. Fried foods reheated in a microwave present an additional wrinkle, because microwaves heat unevenly. Certain spots become intensely hot while others stay lukewarm, and those overheated microzones are where the highest concentrations of harmful compounds tend to form, often without any visible burning. The more resilient approach is straightforward. Use fresh oil each time you fry, and if you must reheat fried food, use a moderate oven temperature that warms it evenly rather than a high-powered microwave blast. The fourth food is the one that trips up even careful home cooks, because the danger here is not primarily about carcinogenic compounds, but about a resilient bacterial toxin. Rice, when cooked and then left at room temperature for too long, can become a breeding ground for a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. Its spores can survive the original boiling process, and if the rice cools slowly and sits out, those spores can multiply and release toxins. Here is the detail most people never learn. Reheating rice kills the bacteria, but it does not destroy the toxins those bacteria already produced. Some of these toxins are genuinely heat-resistant and survive standard reheating in a microwave or on a stovetop. In the short term, this is what causes the sudden, unpleasant bout of food poisoning some people associate, often mistakenly, with the rice itself being old, when the real issue was how it was cooled and stored. There is also a slower, longer-term consideration that researchers are increasingly interested in. Repeated gastrointestinal irritation, from any recurring source, contributes over years to a background level of inflammation in the digestive tract, and chronic inflammation is one of the most well-documented pathways connected to gastrointestinal disease risk more broadly. The fix for rice has very little to do with willpower and everything to do with timing. Cool it quickly, within about an hour of cooking, refrigerate it promptly, consume it within a day or two, and when you do reheat it, make sure it is heated evenly and thoroughly rather than briefly warmed in the center. Standing back from all four of these examples, a pattern becomes clear, and it is a pattern worth remembering long after the specific foods are forgotten. Risk in nutrition science rarely comes from a single meal. It comes from repetition, from the thousands of small decisions made across years, decades, and an entire lifetime of eating. A single reheated hot dog will not define anyone's health outcome, but a household habit of microwaving processed meat on high heat every single week, for 20 years, is a different mathematical proposition entirely. This is the same logic that applies to sun exposure, to alcohol, to every chronic disease risk factor researchers study. It is rarely the exception that matters. It is the pattern. There is also a psychological layer to why this particular topic resonates so strongly with people, and it is worth naming directly. Leftovers represent something deeply practical and even virtuous in most households. Reheating food is how people avoid waste, save money, and manage busy schedules. Learning that a habit built on responsibility and thrift might carry a hidden cost feels uniquely unsettling, more so than learning about a food most people already suspect is unhealthy. The brain does not expect danger to be hiding inside good intentions, which is exactly why this information tends to stick once it is understood properly. None of this is a reason to fear your refrigerator or to abandon meal prepping, batch cooking, or the entirely reasonable practice of saving food for later. The research here does not point toward elimination. It points toward small adjustments in timing, temperature, and method that cost nothing and take no extra time, but that shift the chemistry in your favor. Cooling food quickly rather than letting it sit out. Storing vegetables and grains for shorter windows rather than longer ones. Reheating gently rather than blasting on high until the edges char. Choosing fresh oil over reused oil. These are not dramatic lifestyle overhauls. They are small corrections that, repeated over years, may meaningfully shift the odds in the same way that repeated poor habits can shift them the other way. It is also worth remembering that cancer risk and long-term gastrointestinal health more broadly are shaped by an enormous number of overlapping factors, including genetics, overall diet quality, physical activity, alcohol use, smoking history, and access to preventive health care. No single food, reheated or otherwise, operates in isolation from all of these other variables. The value of understanding this specific chemistry is not to create anxiety around dinner, but to add one more piece of practical, evidence-based awareness to the much larger picture of how daily habits accumulate to long-term health outcomes. There is something quietly powerful about realizing that health is rarely built or broken in dramatic moments. It is built in kitchens, in the 10 seconds it takes to decide whether to let a pot cool on the counter or move it straight into the fridge, in the choice to reheat something on a lower setting instead of the highest one, in the decision to eat yesterday's greens cold instead of steaming them again. These are not the choices anyone romanticizes. They will never make it into a highlight reel of a healthy lifestyle. But they are, in a very real sense, where health is actually made meal after meal, week after week, for decades. The next time leftovers go back into the fridge, that small pause to think about how and when they will be reheated might be one of the quietest, most overlooked forms of long-term self-care available in an ordinary kitchen. If you found this useful, consider sharing it with the person in your life who reheats the same lunch every single day without thinking twice about it. Understanding the food on your plate a little more deeply is never wasted knowledge, and small, consistent choices, made in ordinary moments, are often what long-term health is actually built from.